Good morning and thanks for coming along today. I'm going to talk to you about the changes to the learning and development regime for solicitors as we move from the CPD to continuing competency. So my name's Stephen Honey. I'm the Head of Learning at LexisNexis. Essentially means I run the webinar program we do. We do some in-house bespoke training, and also there's the opportunity to hire the studio, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Before that, I was working for the Law Society for a number of years, so managing their publishing program and also setting up and running an online training portal, the CPD Centre. So there's a lot of change in CPD at the moment, and it's a great time to be here. So I'm sorry I'm not here in person today. The reason for that is a few weeks ago I was persuaded to sign up for a charity bike ride with a few colleagues from LexisNexis. So we're cycling from the London office all the way to Amsterdam over 3 days. So as you watch this, hopefully I'll be somewhere between here and Dover. So I'm sorry you have to make do with the video. One of my colleagues will be here in the room with you, so they can take any questions that you have at the end, or you can get back to me. I've got my contact details at the end of the presentation. So thanks very much. So I'm going to cover 3 things today. So firstly, how the CPD scheme is changing for solicitors, what the practical implications of these changes are, and then finally what support LexisNexis can provide to help you through those. So starting with the changes to the CPD scheme, I'll talk a little bit about the pre-existing scheme, so prior to the 1st of April this year. You're probably all very familiar with it. I suppose the same rules had essentially been in place for about 30 years, so since 1985. So you might think, well, it's pretty much ripe for a change. It was a very simple system, so it was hours based. You had to take 16 hours of training during the CPD year, which runs from the 1st of November to the end of October. And of those 16 hours, 4 of them had to be accredited training. So that meant that the providers who offered that training needed to be accredited by the SRA, which essentially meant that you'd pay them a fee, you'd register with them, you'd probably send them a few outline course programs, they would approve that, and you were good to go. So there were probably 300 to 400 providers that were accredited in that way, but that's no longer the case. So there were a number of criticisms of the scheme. I suppose people felt that you were doing a certain number of hours of training, you may not necessarily have learnt anything in doing those hours, so you just had to turn up. And I guess that also led to a rush at the end of the CPD year, so during October people would feel, oh, I've got to get my 16 hours, so I'll take any course I can get basically. So you'd get employment lawyers going on family law courses, etc. So this wasn't really felt to be great for people's learning and development. It was more of a sort of tick box exercise. So in June 2011 the Legal Education and Training Review was launched. So that was looking at training for solicitors, barristers and legal executives, and that came out with a number of recommendations. And so finally that led to the SRA announcing its own way of implementing these changes in May of last year. So what does the new scheme look like? So from the 1st of April this year, instead of having a very large rule book saying how the CPD regulations should be applied, SRA is going for a much simpler system. So they're saying the whole scheme is underpinned by Principle 5 of the SRA handbook, which basically says that practitioners have to provide a proper standard of service. So they're saying if you don't undertake your learning and development activities, you don't keep up to date with changes in the law, it's very unlikely that you'll be offering a proper standard of service. So since 1st of April, solicitors have had a choice. So they can either continue to complete their 16 hours of training, as they have previously, or they can move to what's called the continuing competence scheme. If you do keep with the 16 hours format, then the main difference to note there is there's no longer accredited training. So the training you get to fulfil that hourly requirement can be through any means at all, any kind of training. And the CPD year is still running in the same way as it had previously, so from 1st of November to the end of October. So it's going to be a step change from the 1st of November next year, so about a year and a half from now, everyone will be moving to the continuing competency scheme. So you can either do it from the 1st of April, you can do it any time up to the 1st of November, but from the 1st of November next year you'll definitely have to be going with the new scheme. So what is continuing competence? Well, it's a totally new system. So the SRA has published something it's called in a competence statement on its website. I've got the URL for that at the end of the slides if you're interested. But it's basically a written statement setting out the abilities and attributes that a competent solicitor ought to have. So it's a model of what a good solicitor looks like, essentially. I won't go into it in great detail, but it's the abilities are grouped under 4 headings. So it's firstly, there's ethics, professionalism and judgment, which is essentially acting honestly with integrity, the sort of things you might expect, and I think are already covered in the SRA handbook elsewhere. Second is technical legal practice, so undertaking legal research, drafting documents, advising clients, negotiating solutions for them, all the sort of things that solicitors do during their day-to-day work. The last 2, a little bit different, so there's working with other people, which covers sort of communication skills and establishing effective working relationships with staff and your clients. And finally, managing yourself and your own work, which, as you might expect, is planning, prioritising, managing your own work, making sure you complete it in a timely way. So the last 2, I don't think they were covered in the training regulations beforehand, so that's a slight change of emphasis, but you think, well, these are things that you will need in your working life, so it's good to cover those. So based around the statement, solicitors have to follow a 4-step process. So essentially you look at the statement. At the start of the year, you reflect on your own practice and you think, well, this is how I measure up against what a competent solicitor looks like. And by going through that process, you'll identify learning and development needs that you need to address. After that, you'll plan how you're going to address those needs. So think about the year ahead, what training you might need to cover. You'll then address those needs by undertaking learning and development activities, and at the end of the year, or during the year, you'll record that, and I guess at the end of the year, you'll evaluate how successful you've been in achieving your aims. So then finally, after you've done all that, you'll need to make an annual declaration that you've considered your training needs and you've taken steps to maintain your competence. So the exact form of the declaration hasn't been decided yet, I don't think, but it's probably going to be a similar format to what you would do currently when you're renewing your practicing certificate. I think currently you're asked to state that you have done your 16 hours. So there's an outline of the new scheme. So what's that going to mean practically? What are the implications of this? So the first thing to say is the new system offers a much greater degree of flexibility. So you've got a lot more choice in how you might want to meet your learning and development needs. It means any type of learning, so classroom-based courses, more informal methods such as mentoring, coaching, work shadowing, research, they're all placed on an equal footing. So you can do as much or as little of that as you want in order to meet your requirements. So the SRA is taking a very unprescriptive, or you might say relaxed approach to the new scheme. They're saying that any approach to learning and development is valid as long as you can demonstrate that it contributes to how you remain competent and to deliver a proper standard of service. So this is pretty much consistent with their approach to other types of regulations, so the handbook. They're really looking at the outcomes, what you're achieving through your learning and development, rather than how you do it and the steps you take to reach that. So another question you want to look at, if you haven't already done so, is whether you want to move to the new scheme now or wait till later in the year, or at any point up to the mandatory implementation date of the 1st of November next year. So the first thing to say there's no requirement to tell the SRA what you want to do. You simply need to move to the new scheme or stick with the hours-based requirement. There's no requirement to tell them what you want to do, that you just need to do it. And I think the thing to say here is that the decision is best made on a firm-wide basis rather than individually. So I have heard of at least one firm where they're leaving it to the individual solicitors to decide whether they want to move to the new scheme or move to continuing competence. That is an approach you can take, but I think it's very hard to maintain a consistent approach throughout the firm if you're going to leave it to the individuals. So I think it's best to decide collectively what you want to do. So one thing you might want to think about is what are other firms doing? Well, there's a sort of online poll on the SRA website which you can look at. When I looked at it a couple of days ago, it was saying, well, about half of firms actually plan to switch from the 1st of April just gone. Another quarter we're going to wait until the mandatory date of the 1st of November next year, and about 18% were thinking of switching at the end of the CPD this year. But as we know from the general election, what people say in polls and what they actually do in reality can be two different things. And what I'm actually hearing on the ground is that most of the larger firms are taking a sort of wait and see approach, and they're going to continue with the hours-based system throughout this year, certainly, and probably up until November next year. So how prepared are our firms for the new system? I think a lot of people are saying it's going to be quite a big culture change, so that you'll have to assess your learning and development needs in a more rigorous way than perhaps you did before. So it might mean a lot of change for some firms, but I think it's really going to depend on the size of the practice. So there was some research that the SRA commissioned and published last year as part of its looking into what the new reforms would be. And the survey results showed that about 80% of firms with 42 or more solicitors already have a written competency framework in place. So I think most of the people here today are going to be working in that type of firm. They'll already be used to the idea of having a competency framework, so the new system is not going to be such a big shock. And a really high level of firms in that bracket also had a means of identifying learning and education needs, or had a formal appraisal review system. So again, that's something that will be part of the new scheme, and if you're already having that sort of system in your firm, probably be less of a shock for you. For smaller firms, probably it will be more of a culture change. So the same survey was showing that only 40% of the smaller firms, so with 1 to 5 solicitors, had a written competency framework. A larger proportion had a means of identifying learning needs, but only about 58% of them had a formal performance review system. So I think that's something they would need to think about more carefully. So the end of the hourly target is one of the major headlines that has been reported about the changes. So they're not having to do 16 hours anymore. But is that true? So according to the Legal Education and Training Group, there's at least one Magic Circle firm that's going to retain hours-based CPD internally. And speaking to other firms, I'm hearing that a lot of them are incorporating an hours-based target into internal appraisal systems. And some of those may even be more than 16 hours. So it's not a particularly onerous target perhaps. Some of them are saying, well, we want our solicitors to do 20 plus, 30 plus hours during the year. That's not a mandatory thing, but it's something that the firms are implementing within their own internal systems. And for certain specialist areas of practice, then you may need to continue doing 16 hours. So, for instance, Association of Personal Injury Lawyers, APL, has said that if you want to remain an accredited member of their system, you will still need to do 16 hours. And the former president, John Spencer, was saying, well, our response is not to change our own CPD requirement, 16 hours for accredited members, and this is our statement as to whether we think it's a good idea to remove the requirement for all solicitors. So I think they really feel that the new scheme is a sort of watering down of the training requirements, and they're very keen to keep an hours-based target in their own scheme. I think the other thing to say about the hourly target is that training activities can now be of any duration. So as long as they are contributing towards your learning and development needs, they don't have to be an hour long particularly. You don't have to watch a webinar for an hour or attend a day-long course. You can break up your learning and development into smaller chunks, so maybe even 10, 15 minutes throughout the day. You might feel that's a more workable way of keeping up to date with the changes that you need to. And in terms of administrative requirements, I suppose the previous scheme had a lot of criticism that it was quite burdensome. You had to record how many hours training you'd done, exactly what activities you'd undertaken. Well, I don't think the new scheme is going to be any less onerous. I mean, it's not mandatory, but I think it would be good practice to record your activity during the year. And the practice compliance section of Lexis PSL has actually developed some template documents to assist with this. So the first of those is a development plan. So at the start of the year, you are supposed to plan your activity and how you'll meet your learning and development needs. So the plan can look at what you plan to address over the year, what you regard as perhaps areas where you're not quite as strong, and how you'll address that to improve. Secondly, the development record. So that will record what you learned, how you're going to put that into practice, what will you do differently as a result of your learning and development activities. And finally, if you're going to stick with the hours-based system at least until next year, you will still need to record the learning you've undertaken, the activities, and how long you've spent on each of those. So one of the other implications of the new system is perhaps increasing the scope for the delivery of online training. So previously there were some quite strong strictures around how online training had to be delivered in order for it to be qualified as accredited training. So it had to be delivered live. There had to be provision for the delegates to be able to pose questions to presenters. They had to be able to answer them in real time. So they were imposing some extra requirements on training providers who offered online training. That's no longer the case. So the end of accredited training means that training activity any of it can be done online. So you could address all your learning development needs through the internet. And in this respect, LexisNexis does have a very strong program of webinars that we offer. So we do 250 webinars during the year. They each last an hour, so they're delivered online. We're covering 25 legal practice areas, 4 tax practice areas, and they're all delivered by recognised experts. So we do make a lot of effort to try and get the very best people speak for us. So I'd hope that any learning development needs you'd find them covered in our webinar program. So another implication of the new scheme is increasing the scope for the delivery of in-house training. So previously, whereas training providers needed to be accredited by the SRA for the training to be accredited, that's no longer the case. I know a lot of law firms used to be accredited, not all of them. Under the new scheme, you don't have to be, so firms are free to offer their staff tailored training on any topic. And I guess the range of topics could be covered is much broader now, so as long as it's covered by the competence statement, it will count towards your learning and development activity. So in this respect, LexisNexis does offer bespoke training. We can source trainers for you, we can develop programs, we'll come into the office and deliver it on site. So if that's something you were interested in, there's a link to a page giving some more details about that at the end of the slide presentation. But if you are doing your own in-house training, then it can be difficult, especially if you've got a number of sites, you're working across a number of jurisdictions perhaps. It can be quite costly and challenging to ensure that delegates have a consistent learning experience. So again, that's something we could help you with. We have a fantastic studio here, which I'm sitting in, where we use to develop our webinar program. But it can also be hired by third parties, so law firms can come in, deliver their own video training. They can develop it so we can deliver live, we can stream it live over the internet, or it can be on demand. So we've got a really well-equipped studio here. We've got some really experienced staff here who can guide you through that, make sure that you get a really good experience out of it. And the studio can be used for a number of purposes. So as well as training, you might use it to sort of marketing, business development purposes, so communicating with clients, showing the expertise of your own people, and communicating your brand values. So we have a number of clients that do that. So an example would be the accountancy firm Baker Tilly. They've recently been using the studio to provide communications around the budget. So I'll show you a short clip of one of those presentations just to show you what can be achieved here.
This budget will be seen as the historic budget at which the abolition of the tax return was announced. In fact, it's not quite as simple as that. You are still going to have to report income to HMRC. It's just that with modern technology, far more of that information is already held within HMRC systems. And the hope is that you will have an individual tax account which will capture as much of the information that HMRC already holds about you in one place.
So if that's something you're interested in, we're having a studio open day on the 23rd of July. If you'd like to come in, we can come in anytime between 10 and 5 and have a much closer look at what we can do here and perhaps discuss any requirements that you have. We'd be delighted if you wanted to come along, and if you do want to, you just need to get in touch with me and let me know when you'd like to arrive. So finally, I guess the other implication of the new scheme is it does increase the focus on skills training. So whereas previously people thought of CPD as mainly being about black letter law, the competence statement does focus quite a bit on soft skills. So parts 3 and 4 of the competence statement, and it gives them just as much emphasis as black letter law. So in this respect, we are planning a series of skills-based webinars that we'll be adding to our programme from this autumn. So I think we'll be doing 8 of those, and they're going to cover topics such as ethics in the workplace. So that ties in with section A1 of the competence statement. We're doing one on communication skills. That ties in with section C1 of the statement. We're doing them on developing and managing client relationships, also effective project management. So if you'd like to know more about those as we fill out the programme, we'll firm up who's going to present them, we can get in touch and let you know a bit more about that. So thanks very much for listening. I'm afraid, as I say, I'm not here in person, but we do have a member of the team in the room who can field any questions that you have. If we can't answer them today, then we can get back to you in the next few days with a follow-up. So thanks again for coming along, and I hope you found it useful.